Well, I'm going to give a dry paper. You hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm sorry I don't have any fancy slides. As a philosopher, we'll just keep it simple. But my talk is called on the Metaphysics of Otherness. When we posit archaic ontology, we evoke the notion of initiation, of arche, hence origins. Psychic and cultural phenomena must have a prehistory, preconditions that stand in relation to their original instantiations. Following the principle of sufficient reason, every mental event must stand in relation to an archaic object that is derived from its original ground. In other words, all psychic experience must stand in relation to its origins. This is the prototype of the unconscious. Extending Eliade's notion of the repetition of the mythical instant of the beginning, what would constitute an archetype aborigine? Not only would psychic experience stand in relation to its fundamental prototype, namely original form, the manifestation of experience itself would by necessity participate of a priori principle. Furthermore, if we presume an archetype, if it exists, reflects an original form, would it not also come from conditions that allowed it to arise in the first place? Its pre-beginnings, so to speak, that which is preformed. This would imply that original form derives from earlier ontic constituencies. Let us start from the standpoint of speculative metaphysics. Assume for the moment an archetype is self-constitutive, that it is a process system or a psychic entity, as Jung calls it, with its own internal pulsions and dynamics in its own right. What if archetypes were begotten from themselves? That is, each archetype is a generative replicator that exudes its essence into concrete manifestations of appearance, the image, for example. What if an archetype is, quote, autonomous, as Jung says, and can generate its own productions in our consciousness, engendered from an unconscious ground, no less? If this is possible, then the concept of the collective unconscious is not required as the generator of archetypes. For archetypes would be propagative and self-producing. In other words, the collective unconscious would be gratuitous, hence not needed to explain the phenomenon of archetypes. This would imply that archetypes ground their own ground, emanating from a primordial Umgrund, so to speak, as ground without a ground. If we proceed from the premise that archetypes are universal and that they originate from archaic humanity, then we must conclude that they are endemic to human nature, even if they appear in pluralistic, even incompatible or antagonistic varieties. Here, archetypes are simply rife. We encounter them every day as part of our perfunctory rituals, interpassively submersed in unconscious cultural conditioning. But what can we say about generalities? On the face of things, we must first appeal to universal features. What is an archetype in our most common understanding? Starting with Jung, we import content into any definition. But what precedes content? What a priori structures condition the appearance of content? If an archetype is self-constituted, or is a self-constituted formal unit that is universal in its unconscious a priorism, only to undergo internal modification and manifest as content, we must therefore explain its movement from internal unity to disruption to manifestation. Here I suggest an archetype must have a basic structure that is dialectically constituted as self-relation to identity and difference. At first, an archetype has a simple unity, which must undergo division, modification, and dispersal into psychic reality. It is destined to disclose itself, to shine forth, to reveal its hidden presence as content in consciousness. The dialectic of identity and difference is therefore inherent to the structure of an archetype, without which it could not appear as particularization. Because archetypal processes do not appear in the same way, but are derived from primordial or archaic forms, they participate of a common ground or essence that that lends order to their appearances. In fact, such internal structures are the very ontic conditions for archetypes to manifest. If an archetype is, at its most basic configuration, a patterning of universal process, then such patterning cannot contain an empty formalism without jeopardizing the integrity of the theory. Rather, I argue the patterning of an archetype arises from its own internal divisions and splitting maneuvers that naturally introduce mediation between oppositions. Such mediations are two-way internal relations that properly belong to the dialectical form of an archetype that bears a basic structural content as the bifunctionality of identity and difference. When an archetype arouses itself from its self-enclosed slumber to the self-certainty of its own pre-reflective being, from implicitness to explicitness, it apprehends itself as unconscious apperception. An archetype performs a pre-subjective determination of instituting differentiation from its previous unmodified shape by a reflection into itself, which raises itself to a determinate being for self as mediated self-certainty. Here the apperceptive act of arousal simultaneously is the conferral of its own discrete identity, that it sets over itself in relation to all particularities of difference. Opposition becomes the internal dynamic in which dialectical mediation takes place, which is ontically conjoined as an interplay between identity and difference. As an archetype intuits itself as an apperceptive being, it gives itself identity that stands in relation to otherness, an otherness that is necessary in order to concretize the act of self-definition as the awakening of its essence as an internal impetus to manifest. The organic sequence of such self-instantiation may further be viewed through the lens of a developmental monistic ontology. Moving from the upheaval of its own disquieted desire to self-apperception constitutes the birth of an archetype, for which our own consciousness may in turn apprehend as a psychic presence populating mental life. Just as an archetype is seized to self-awaken, so too the human mind is jarred to feel its internal reality. Of course, we could be speaking generally about raw affect or emotions in general, but the phenomenal appearance is qualitatively different. Archetypes feel like they are connected to something outside of or independent from the self, despite the fact that they arise from and are encountered within. In this way, we may further say that an archetype is the epitome of otherness, for its experiential announcement and imposition on consciousness is registered as an unfettered event. The epistemology of this seemingly autonomous process is what adds a further layer of numinosity to the experience, even if we are mistaken or deluded in interpreting the agency of their internal recurrence. When the psyche comes to notice the myriad patterns in which archetypes manifest, a recurrent theme of repetition cannot escape the discerning, self-reflective cogito. An archetype is originally another to itself, the primordial form of otherness, as alienation from its essence or internal nature, only to discover itself in its own process of becoming as a procreant developmental act. Its initial otherness is ontically entwined in the formal structure of opposition. It must mediate and dialectically engage through intermediate dynamic relations of participation in differentiating, reconciling, and synthesizing its various schemata or self-states through informational exchange. The archetypes breach into self-relation via discerning otherness, hence non-identity, outside of its original formal solipsistic unity, is the first dialectical movement toward discovering and defining self-identity that is mediated through conferring difference as non-identicalness. In short, the coming to presence of an archetype within psychic reality is initiated by the breaking up of or split in unity. This initial deed of self-assertion, of pure, utter announcement, is the procreative act of mind that draws on the original motif of all cosmogonies. What is archetypal is first, the coming into being of being. To reiterate my point, and bears repeating, archetypes represent and stand in relation to psychic origins. Although archetypes are everywhere in psyche and culture, we must not lose sight of their fundamental significance. Hence, they are replications of original form. We may further say they are self-generating replicators, or we could not encounter their ubiquity without the antediluvian drive of spontaneous repetition. Civilization is compelled to reproduce them in our psychosocial arrangements that govern human exchange, based on the simple fact that we remember and rewrite history in our preoccupation with the past. This sociological observance highlights the primacy of looking back at, revisiting, acknowledging, and even savoring history as an idealized need for nostalgia, not as immediate presence, but as recapitulation, eternal recurrence. This is why the imaginary has such a strong hold over consciousness, for archetypes repeat themselves through images and associative fantasies that are more or less timeless. This notion, or fantasy, of eternal recurrence is the psychomythology the mind generates and gravitates toward in order to confer meaning and ground its being. In this way, archetypes are the foundation and fulfillment of archaic ontology. Every reproduction, every repetition stands in nihilo tempore of attempts at duplication and regeneration. What is the most basic form of regeneration? May I suggest the search for sameness or familiarity with indifference, the restoration of the universal, the reiteration of the eternal. To be more accurate, it's the dialectic of desire and difference that we re-encounter within the process of the need to return, even though this return is prefaced on the pining for novelty in its attempt at renewal. The basic act of cleavage rests on the institution or insertion of difference in mediatory relations. Therefore, the discernment or interjection of difference introduces a bifurcation within original universality that inaugurates the split as a new bi-unity. Looking for sameness or similarity is to look for universality within difference. This ensures that all acts of judgment identify difference in conferring identity, and that differentiation stands in relation to the universal. Differentiation implies otherness, if not opposition, the supersession of unity. The break from oneness lost origin. The need to return to familiarity is both a self-grounding act of identity and a regenerative function of recapitulating. Excuse me. I'll repeat that after I take a drink. The need to return to familiarity is both a self-grounding act of identity and a regenerative function of recapitulating essence. Just as an archetype discovers itself in otherness, the other is the externalization from sameness and lost unity. In its otherness, it wants to return to itself, its lost immediacy, yet at the same time seeks the universal in its differentiation. In other words, difference, variety, and plurality signifies the other, the archetype's initial self-instantiation as becoming other to itself. The breaking up of initial unity is tantamount to the cosmogonic act of dispersing its essence into the world. Difference, particularization, and plurality always stand in relation to original form, which it originated. Yet, in its modification, it still stands ontically interrelated and interdependent upon its original ground or inception. Patternings become the logical prototype for archetypes to manifest, hence giving rise to alterations in content and contextual appearances. Although divisions of otherness, mutually implicative conflicts, and complexes exist within intrapsychic domains of individuals and societies, wed to certain worldviews and values that intersubjectively oppose others, alterity also becomes a social manifestation of splits in identity and difference that maintain certain antitheses in our lived experiences and perceptions of the world. This ensures that otherness becomes a fulcrum in the construction of identity based upon differentiation and unfamiliarity, the internalization process, and the nature of recognition and relationality towards shared and negated identifications and values. Recognition of otherness is an immediate unconscious prehension that is internally registered, pre-reflectively evaluated, and compared to self-identity, and dialectically mediated as a self-other relation. Here, the alien archetype is only one such appearance of otherness, much like the shadow, which subsumes the destructive principle of humankind. But what is alien to us is none other than our own projective identification with our disavowed interiority that is perceived as foreign. Yet it is precisely this foreignness we come to recognize as our counterpart we identify with in our reacquaintance with lost universality in ourselves. We come to know who we are by seeing ourselves in the other's desire as reacquaintance with lack. We see ourselves in the other, our own lost, alienated yearning, as being in relation to lack, a return of original form. This is why we are internally divided and often have to confront many occasions of difference and conflict that seek their dialectical solutions through suspending, negating, binding, or unifying opposition. Here, the transcendent function becomes a regathering of the original split in unity, synthesized through our reflective acts of apprehending otherness. This ensures that alterity remains a definitive role in the structure and function of archetypes. Archetypes always evoke the spectra and specter of the other, for differentiation and difference permeate the penumbral background that informs experience. All experiences presuppose reference to the other, namely archaic mentality of the collective ethos, the cultural symbolic that conditions the historicity of civilizations and race in memoriam. This symbolic other is always there, even when concealed, undisclosed, or non-manifest. It is equivalent to the Lacanian real, the residue of the symbolic that remains foreclosed, occluded, residing outside the chain of signification as a remainder of ineffable desire and lack. The dialectic of the familiar and the foreign always interpenetrates our encounter with otherness, whether in acceptance or confrontation. Alterity stems from the a priori ground of the archaic and is part and parcel of the human condition. This archaic ground is in fact an abyss from which all emerges, the psychic underworld that springs forth into familiar unfamiliarity, an uncanny return to home. The other is the supersession of original unity as particularized plurality, only to participate within the one, the encompassing universality that pervades psyche and culture. As an archetype disperses its essence into multiplicity, it becomes other to itself, only to recover its original lost unity in such otherness as a return to itself. In the arche is origo, an opening, another to arise. Thank you.